I think it comes to a moment now when we're going to focus on more engagement with those who are present today and our online viewers. So there are a lot of people watching across the country and others watching from around the globe. Hopefully, as you speak, my request is that please look straight to the camera so that you can engage those who are watching online. As well, those who are online, please be engaged. If you could post your questions, we'll try to get some of the questions over to them. And then the other comments later on, the OBC leadership will compile your comments and probably communicate to you through the website. To my left, great friends of the organization. I'll post the first three questions to them. They have some of these questions ahead of time, so I think they're very well prepared. Then I'll hand over to them to ask specific questions. Hopefully we should be able to wrap that up within the first 20 minutes. Also, just a reminder that shortly after this, we'll be talking about governance and parliamentary politics. We do have Kenyan parliamentarians here. We also have some governors from different parts of the country. So shortly after that, we'll have them and we'll be engaging them as well. So my request also to the members of Kenyan Parliament, pay attention to what the World Bank people are talking about, because some of the questions will be structured based on their presentation and how you're working to meet those specific goals in Kenyan government. So as well, those ones watching live, if you want to engage our Kenyan parliamentarians, feel free please to post those questions online. Shortly after this, we also post those questions to be part of a larger engagement with the diaspora community rather than the four of us on board. So gentlemen, first question to both of you. I don't know who's going to go first. The first question is, and I would like you to be as specific as possible. And your economy, sometimes we use tough language that not all of us understand. If you could please use a language that is more understandable to the larger audience. And the first question is, what is the role and or strategy of the World Bank in developing African countries? And if you could please be as specific as possible to the East African region, which is Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, because it's very well represented here.
Okay. I mean, the role of the World Bank, I mean, the broad goal of the World Bank is try to eradicate extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity. So basically what we do in our lending program is try to identify the areas that and in conversation, of course, with client governments and stakeholders and donors, the areas where the World Bank can contribute to the government plan in order to make a dent in reducing poverty, right? Of course, the obstacles to development differ across countries in the region, right? In some cases it's human development programs. In other cases it's sustainable development programs. There's a lot of programs, initiatives that the bank has in terms of, for instance, trying to enhance access to finance, right? And also supporting country reforms to boost transparency at all levels when it comes to, for instance, reporting economic statistics, so civil society can vet the government and try to make a more informed decision in elections in the future, and also transparency in terms of sound procurement systems. So hopefully the public investment management system of these countries can deploy resources in a more effective way. And this is very important because in the current economic context that we have, where many countries in the region have been cut access to markets because it's too expensive, governments may need to be very selective on the way that they spend the money. No? And that's where it's important to have a good pipeline of projects and have good systems that can not only prepare but also appraise those projects. And I think I'm going to stop here.
Thank you for the response. Move on to the next question. There might be follow-up questions, but for now I'm going to go to the next question. Whoever is going to respond to this one. What specific initiative does the World Bank have in place for East Africa? If you could, I know the presentation was more general about the sub-Saharan African region, but we'd rather have very specific, and the Kenyans here, Ugandans, Tanzanians watching, what are the specific plans the World Bank has for those respective countries?
So, as Cesar said, the approach the bank takes, it has our main twin goals, which is eradication of poverty and supporting shared prosperity, but then each country approach is determined through a dialogue with the government. So the bank publishes documents that outline the strategy for the coming years, that is determined by what the priorities from the government point of view are, what the needs are in the country, and what the bank thinks is also an opportunity. So in East Africa, as well as in other parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, one particular priority we have at the moment is around improving energy access. So there are more than 600 million Africans who don't have access to modern energy services. And so the bank is working in several different ways, including in East Africa, around this priority. And this can take the form of several different things. So some of it is about improving the access to grid electricity and the quality of the grid electricity provided. We do a lot of work with the utilities to improve the service that people receive in terms of energy access. But there's also increasingly work being done to promote renewable energy technologies, the deployment of renewable power across the region, and in some cases promoting off-grid solutions. So in places where it's not economic to extend the grid, particularly to remote and more rural areas, there might be opportunities for the private sector to come in and provide off-grid renewable solutions. So this can take the form of mini-grids and other kinds of renewable technology to help meet this aspirational goal that we have of connecting all of these 600 plus million people to modern energy services.
Okay. Good. Thank you. This one's okay? Okay. Thank you. I want to move on to the next question. I might have a follow-up question on that. And this is, let's talk about the structural adjustment programs. Probably is not a term that most people are familiar with, but in the late 1980s and early 90s, there was a structural adjustment programs to the African countries backed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Both of you are economists with a special focus on Africa. Having done the evaluation at the moment, how effective do you think those structural adjustment programs were to the continent?
Well, I have to say that at least I was a teenager in the 1980s, so I should not be liable to. No, I'm just joking. I mean, the record with the structural adjustment programs has been mixed. I mean, all over the world. There have been some cases where it was relatively successful, and some cases where it was a failure. And I think like the next waves of programs have realized that in order for policies to have a dent on the goals that you want to achieve, you need to have solid institutions. Without solid institutions, it's going to be very difficult to push reforms. That's one thing. The second thing, you need to somehow gather the imagination of people behind these reforms, because without the support from your citizens, there's not going to be success. I mean, sometimes governments, and I can say that, for instance, in Latin America in the 80s, policies were created from the top down. But sometimes you need to go back to civil societies, to citizenships, to have dialogue with workers and entrepreneurs to try to gather momentum, gather reform momentum. Otherwise, I think any reform is not going to be successful, to be honest.
Just a follow-up on that, one of the criticisms that most economists and experts on African development had about the structural adjustment programs was that the intent, as was intended by your end, was okay, but the problem was probably the World Bank did not do due diligence to understand the ground. In other words, they didn't understand the social, economic, and political issues on ground. On paper, this was the intent, but the reality on the ground was contrary to the expectation, and that's part of why the structural adjustment did not work to most. Now, World Bank having done the assessment and evaluation, has that been improved?
I think the current bank policies at least try to be aware of the country context. There's no one-size-fits-all solutions. Countries in the region or countries across the world are different, right? So I think one way for us to incorporate the local context into policy advice, because we just give policy advice, is not only having offices in the field, no? Sending our experts to the field too, to work in those countries, so we can have at least a flavor of the country. And we need that because You need to be in the country to know how institutions work, how you can implement and push the reforms. Where are going to be the obstacles? Where are going to be the gains? Right. So I think in this context, I think both all multilaterals have taken that into account and have improved the relationship with government clients.
If you don't mind me lightly asking this question, having done the research, in terms of representation, if I work with the World Bank right now, do you think the World Bank has the staff that is representative of the African market?
I mean, to be honest with you, I don't know if I'm capable of answering that question. But I mean, for instance, if you come to the bank and you come to the Africa region, there's a big participation of Africans that have been policymakers. Some of them, or some of them is basically talent, African talent that was recruited from top universities. No, so, and my boss, the chief economist, he's from Kenya. No, so and my previous boss was from Cameroon. So we not only have African talent working at the economist level, but also in upper management.
Good. Thank you very much. Just last question before I let my colleagues ask their question.
It's the fall of the American empire.
Whoever has heard is that I did not intend to do that. Apologies for viewers. It's still a good business. Please do engage with them. We'll get the glass back on stage. So if you could, right here, and those who are watching online, the African diaspora is a very, very vibrant, well-educated, well-versed population, and some of them are watching, and actually some of them are present here today. If you could pass a message here, what do you think are your objectives for this particular expo, and you guys have financed this? And after today, are there specific engagements that you rather want to engage with the diaspora so that going forward, the diaspora community and the World Bank can work in partnership to develop our region?
Absolutely. So first off, I mean, we're delighted to be here and to be starting this engagement, talking to you, and hope there'll be other opportunities. The diaspora has an incredibly valuable role to play in the region. We actually run several programs within our office at the World Bank to help connect talented members of the diaspora to senior African policymakers, to actually help staff up their policymaking units to benefit from the ideas and talent among the diaspora and elsewhere. So one of the things we do is we convene a network of presidential economic advisors all across sub-Saharan Africa. We bring them together on a regular basis, and they need talent. They need young and mid-career economists and other kinds of policy advisors to help them to give the best possible advice to their own governments as they can. And the diaspora is one of the pools that they deliberately try and tap into, and we help them in doing that. So we try to advertise these opportunities, we try to reach as many as we can, but working with you will have an opportunity to reach an even wider audience. So this is very specific to the work that we do at the World Bank with African policymakers. I think more generally, it's very important, particularly in the years ahead, that there is mobilization of capital and talent from among the diaspora. This is going to be so critically important. We heard from Cesar about the challenges around indebtedness, and this is not going to go away overnight. Hopefully the inflationary pressures are subsiding, but the debt will remain. But on top of that, there's a lot of reasons for optimism. I mentioned before the programs around encouraging investment in renewable energy technologies. During my presentation, I mentioned the opportunity around the low-carbon transition and how it relates to metals and minerals, but also to value addition, the battery mineral chains, and these kinds of things. All of this is going to be contingent on not just the governments taking the right reforms and putting the right policies in place, but it's going to be contingent on getting the right entrepreneurs, getting the right ideas, getting the right talent, getting the right companies, being present in these countries, and the right flows of capital. And this is something where I think this community can play a really important role. Thank you.
Thank you very much again for those who's watching online. If you could, they did a presentation, and I think if you can go, you should be able to see the facts as they're presented. So I'm going to turn to my left here, and now you're going to see on the hot seat from my colleagues here, and starting off, in the African setting, usually it's the ladies go first. So the gentlemen are very good looking, but I'm going to ignore them for now. And welcome the lady to ask the first question.
Thank you. My name is Catherine Gaduka Franklin. I'm a CPA by profession, working in this space here in Diaspora, born and raised in Kenya. So a couple of questions that came to mind from your presentation. One of them, taxation. As a CPA, of course, taxation is a key thing that I engage with on a day-to-day basis, even though it's U.S. taxation. But you mentioned that taxation, you feel that taxation of fossils is taxed, and that would be a source of revenue that would help mitigate budgets, as well as, the money that the economy, that would mitigate the issues of funding in the economy. So what are you doing to facilitate the knowledge or policy changes so that taxation can increase on those fossils? And then I'd have a second question after that.
Maybe we can take a couple of questions and then we'll try and answer them in a group.
All right, so the second question I have is on the carbon emissions. At a time when companies in the Western world have carbon emission goals and, of course, producing a lot of carbon emissions, and Africa being mostly renewable, especially with places like Kenya and Tanzania being renewable energy sources, and so therefore their net carbon emissions are like almost zero. What is the World Bank doing in two things? One, facilitating whether it's education or policy change that helps Africa understand their carbon exchanges, and they can participate, and that can be a revenue source. I mean, when you think about the big dams that are producing the electricity in Kenya that you are talking about being transmitted around the country, I mean, how can the World Bank facilitate the African nations participating in the carbon exchanges? And two, the manufacturing. How do we bring these companies that have carbon emission goals to manufacture in Africa so that they can also meet their carbon emission goals?
Great, thank you. Okay, so these are very important questions, and of course, addressing climate change, both the impacts from climate change, but also what we can do to help mitigate climate change, is a big priority for the World Bank. So there is a lot of work being done here, a lot of new work being done here. And this relates actually to the first point about the taxation of petroleum. So the world still consumes a lot of oil and gas. That is likely to continue for some time. And a lot of that oil and gas happens to be found in sub-Saharan Africa. And so part of what we work with countries to do is to help ensure that they get the best value from their resources while there is still demand for that oil and gas, but also to prepare for a future where that oil may not be demanded in the same kinds of quantities. Now, I mentioned a couple of pieces in my presentation. There's a lot more in the report. For those of you who are interested, you can download it. Just Google Africa's Pulse, and we go into this in more detail than I can mention today. But certainly, capturing rents from the oil and gas sector is very difficult. Countries all over the world struggle with this. This is not a uniquely African challenge. But there are things that countries can do to improve how much they capture from the sector. One is try to have a stable fiscal regime, but one that has clear ways in which the country can benefit when prices go up. And the reason why you want to benefit when prices go up is because if you don't, there's a lot of political pressure to then change the tax regime. And I've seen this in the UK. We change the taxation of the North Sea oil and gas more often than any other country in the world. Because politically, every time the price changes, there's pressure to change the tax rate. There are ways in which you can set the tax rate up front such that there isn't that kind of political pressure, that you benefit when the profits of the companies increase and when they decrease. So that's just one idea that we talk about in the report. On the question around carbon markets and climate mitigation more generally, so firstly, there are many investments that the bank is helping countries to make into deploying renewable energy technology in terms of increasing energy access and so on. There are more innovative solutions on the frontier. So Gabon, for example, was the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to actually negotiate a payments for forest protection at a sovereign level. Some other countries have been doing this for a few years. So Brazil has had a very prominent program to help protect the Amazon. and this is something that it could be a model for other countries in the region. There's a huge amount of forest that is incredibly valuable as a carbon sink, and humanity is going to be in big trouble if we start cutting down all the forests of Central and Western Africa. So this is going to be very important that we find these kinds of innovative financing solutions to indicate the value that we place on protecting these forests and allow countries to capture some of that value in exchange for real protection. Similarly, there are opportunities around concessional financing for renewable energy technologies, other kinds of low-carbon solutions, and a lot of emphasis now on collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. This is going to be a big growth area for private enterprise, for private capital. There's a lot of opportunities, not just in terms of the unmet energy demand, but in terms of the co-financing that's going to come from multilaterals and the public sector to actually push us more in the direction of renewables. And thankfully, the cost of many renewable energy technologies has fallen so dramatically in the last 20 years that it's actually cheaper than building coal-fired power stations or other kinds of fossil fuel-based energy. Thank you.
Good, thank you. So we're going to try to accommodate as many questions as possible. We're running out of time. If we could go, do you want to go next? Do you want to?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
My name is Alex Karundu. I'm based in Dallas. They call me the unofficial mayor of Dallas for Kenyans. Benson can attest to that. I'm in the SME, and I'm proud to be here. I've met Mr. James before in different forums, and thank you for what you're doing in the World Bank and impacting our country specifically. In this room we have a lot of politicians, so my questions are going to be a little bit more political. One is that there is quite a disparity between the interest rates that are charged on African countries against actually the people who have more money get very little cost on the money they borrow from bilateral and multilateral institutions like World Bank. So why so? And then another question that maybe pops up quite also a political question. If you look at the loans that are maturing, and especially those coming from the third world and Kenya specific, we borrow money when the dollar is exchanging at a certain level, maybe at 100 shillings. And by the time the loan matures, the dollar rate is exchanging at 130. Beside the interest, then we have to couple with the difference of the exchange, so that the money that we're paying back is in Kenya shillings, because we're converting the resources that are coming internally to pay external. Is there a way that the World Bank can influence? And I'm sure maybe, I don't know whether you have those answers. This could be a rhetoric question, but I hope you do have a way to answer that. Where then, at a point of borrowing, we can lock those rates to where the borrower, the African, especially those upcoming, African market, can sustain those loans. And finally, what is the view of World Bank in the power shift, the global power shifting right now, or the unstable power that is moving towards the China-Russia axis versus the U.S. that has been predominantly the source of the World Bank or the base of World Bank? Thank you.
Ask questions so that you guys can respond to some questions if you could.
Mine is, good afternoon, my name is Benson Kasue. I'm from Dallas. I represent East African Business Network. This is the Dallas team, the big three. So Dallas is very well represented. My question is simple. You shared a lot of statistics here during your presentations, and the question that I have is, how reliable are the indexes that you're using? I know a few years back, World Bank was pressured by China and Saudi Arabia to affect the indexes that they use to make decisions. How can we have confidence in the numbers you presented, and has that problem been resolved? Thank you very much.
Good questions. Okay. Yes, ask very good, tough questions here. So, okay, yes, can check. Hope you remember the questions.
Yeah, it's working. Thank you for your questions. Regarding interest rates, I mean, of course, you're going to have different sources of financing for a country, right? And those countries, depending on the sourcing, is the interest rate that you get, right? I mean, in the case of the bank, you have a concessional financing that typically takes the form of grants or loans at a very low interest rate. Countries in the region that are low-income countries and lower middle-income countries that belong that are considered IDA countries, they have access to these loans. Of course, resources are limited, so there's a size of that window that they can, I think the problem that we're talking about now, at least the one that you're mentioning, is the fact that during the last, let's say, since the 2008-2009 crisis, you had a big expansion of monetary policy in advanced countries. There was abundant global liquidity, and African countries had access to market, whether issuing Eurobonds, whether contracting commercial loans, right? And those are market-based interest rates, right? So this is like, imagine if you're trying to borrow to buy a house, and you lock in your interest rate, what you're trying to say, at a fixed rate, right? Or instead of that, you try to get a loan that is an adjustable rate that is lower than that fixed rate. The problem is that you know that at some point that interest rate is going to come up. And maybe at the moment of redemption of that bond or the redemption of that loan, the interest rate is going to be bigger, right? So it's part, I think it's part of risk management from the country to do that. That's one thing. The second thing, you're borrowing in foreign currency. So of course there are going to be currency risks attached to that, right? I mean, let's say that the situation where you have now, where you have a big external shocks and interest rates come up, and unfortunately currencies in our countries weaken. Of course, you saw the graph that we presented there. The debt service is going to be huge. It's going to be big, right? So I think in this context, I think what we advise is governments to be more prudent in the type of borrowing that they will do. Like for instance, unfortunately, you have this big problem on debt in African countries. Why? Because, for instance, let's say an African country that decides to finance infrastructure. Would you take a Eurobond for 10 years to finance infrastructure? No. But they did, So this is where, you need to have more prudent and more responsible debt management offices that would help you improve engineering. We can give advice, but it's in your hands, guys, to try to, in the hands of the government, to try to undertake the sound debt management practices. Now, if you think about the progress that African countries made back before the global financial crisis, and also emerging market countries, they were able to reduce currency risks, they were able to reduce interest rate risks and improve in terms of the maturity of their loans. But now it all reverted. Okay, I think in that extent, I think part of the advice that we give is try to maintain stability. I mean, I come from a country that suffered a period of hyperinflation, and as long as we didn't have a record of stability after that episode, we weren't able to sell securities in our own currency. So we've experienced that phenomenon that you call the original sin, right? You can issue debt, but not in your own currency, right? But the record of stability in developing countries has allowed them to issue in their own currency. The other thing is the stability is also a precondition for African countries to try to develop even more local currency debt markets. That's going to be one way where African countries can reduce these currency risks that you were talking about. I'm going to be very brief on the geoeconomic tensions, the U.S. versus China blocks. I mean, this is something that we're observing already. I wouldn't go to the extreme, But this is the moment where we have to think about, especially for Africa, because Africa, I think the African continent doesn't have the luxury to pick sides. The African country needs to trade and to receive investments from everywhere in the world. This is a country that needs, this is a continent that needs financing for development. We have to, I think the international community needs to understand that financing development in Africa is a global good. And it's a global good because we know that in the next 50 or 100 years, the African population is going to drive the global labor force. And I'll stop here and give the mic to you.
Thank you. So maybe I can say a little bit about the question relating to statistics. So you saw we use many statistics in our work, in our presentations, in our reports, and the data we use is an incredibly important part of the World Bank's work, both in terms of making sure that our analysis is accurate and reliable, but also putting that data out there available for others to do their own analysis. Now, the incident you're referring to relates to an index called the Doing Business Rankings. This, in light of this problem, has been abolished. So the short answer to your question, has this been resolved? It's been resolved in the form of there are no more Doing Business Rankings anymore. Now, the challenge, I think, arose in the sense that, unlike a lot of our statistics, the Doing Business survey was very explicitly about ranking countries against each other. And it was trying to measure the ease of opening new businesses and then conducting business in these countries. And many governments became very sensitive to where they fell in these rankings. And so there was a lot of political optics around this. You even had, in some countries, for example, President Kagame, he made it one of his major priorities for Rwanda to rise rapidly in the rankings over time. And he put a lot of effort into his government focusing on this, and they had huge success, actually. And this was a really powerful signal to the rest of the world that Rwanda was open for business and was taking these kinds of reforms seriously. Now, that's the good side of it. The bad side of it is because people took this ranking so seriously and paid so much attention to it, there's also a lot of political expectation around how you perform. Now, it's been gotten rid of because I don't think that was so core to what the World Bank is trying to do that it was worth the distraction to have something where the integrity was being questioned. And I don't think that this kind of challenge relates to, say, the debt numbers that you've seen, the GDP numbers that you've seen, the kind of statistics that we present in our everyday work. And actually, there's a lot of really great innovation happening around data that allows us to check data from other sources. So GDP numbers, for example, there's been some great work done using satellite data, particularly using night lights and other kinds of measures of economic activity, where you can basically verify whether these GDP numbers are more or less accurate depending on which country you're measuring them from. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, the study found that certain kinds of autocracies, the GDP numbers were much less accurate relative to the numbers coming from the satellite data. So there is this risk of some inaccuracies where we rely on the authorities to report us certain numbers, but the bank and other international institutions do the absolute best they can do with the resources we have to make sure they are accurate and have integrity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent presentation. I wish we had more time to engage in this very insightful discussion, but out of time and respect of others who are going to some other business, and I'm sure you guys are heading out as well. If you could do me a favor, look straight to the camera. We have our online viewers. If you could say just one sentence, one closing statement to them.
Sure. So what I'd like to close on is the data we presented today. Some of it is pretty gloomy. The global economic conditions are very difficult at the moment, and this is no different in many African economies. However, we do think there are reasons for optimism. Cesar already pointed to the fact that we think that inflation has peaked, and we're hopefully on the downward side of this now. This may also be true in terms of the tightening environment, the monetary policy tightening environment in the OECD countries. At least by the end of this year, we should be through the tightening cycle. But we see other bright spots. And so what I wanted to emphasize was the opportunity coming from the low carbon transition, that we see there's real genuine appetite in global capital markets to invest in this area. There's real growth in the demand for metals and minerals that Africa has in abundance. So there's a big opportunity there. But it's not going to happen automatically. It's going to be about getting the right kinds of government reforms in place, but it's also going to be the right kind of capital and talent and entrepreneurship to unlock this economic opportunity. Thanks.
Well, I'm going to be brief, and I'm going to say that even though we presented a gloomy scenario, the solution is in the hands of Africans. The solution is in the hands of their governments, of their population. And this is where it's important for African investors and African governments to be efficient, to try to identify the projects where they can get the biggest bang for the buck for the country, you know. And again, I want to finish with, I think a member in the previous panel was talking about education. I think it's important to invest in the most important resource of the African continent, which is its people.
So I think that concludes our discussion here. I want to thank, if you could please all of you join me in giving a big round of applause. First, let's begin with the questionnaires here. Alex, thank you very kindly. Catherine, thank you very kindly, as well as my friend Ben here. Also, many thanks to the representative from the World Bank. Thank you for sparing time to be part of this and the presentation. We truly appreciate it, and our hope is that you will continue to engage with us. And I think that's the best way we can do, not just to develop the African region, but quite frankly to develop humanity all over the world. So many thanks, and those of you watching us online, thank you so much for being with us. We'll momentarily close here, and then we'll welcome the Kenyan parliamentarians here to talk about governance and parliament. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big one for this team. Man, you always impress me. I don't know how you do this, but you do a very good job. A big one for Mr. The World Bank team, thank you guys. James,
They have a question.
oh, okay. All right. We're not happy. Okay, good job. I can allow one question. Good job. No, you're in the high school, but I cannot. So, no. No. Yes. Yeah, I can't stop you.
Welcome.
Really, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I have to apologize. Okay. Microphone. Oh, sorry, I have to apologize. He had a transit issues. Finally, he's here, so he just landed from Kenya.
Yes.
Welcome.
Apologies for arriving late and asking a question when the session is finished, but highly appreciate the discussion that has been going on. Mine is a very pragmatic question. World Bank is giving different funds to Kenya for various programs. I'm particularly involved in one of the programs that helps the youth in employability and enterprise development. It also borders on helping young mothers and young people with disabilities. The process of the funding is very clear because World Bank will say, we've given 15 billion shillings, for argument's sake, for such a program. But the transition between when the money lands to the country and when it gets to the actual activity, the bureaucracy is very complex, and you find that maybe half or three-quarters of the money comes back because it was not utilized. Not because the need was not there, but because of the processes that are involved in making that happen. How do you mitigate for those questions, and how do you respond to the fact that, I'll give that particular example, maybe 50% of the funds were not utilized? That's my very specific question.
You want to take that question? Go ahead.
Okay, so
You should be okay.
Oh, yeah, it's on. Okay. So this is a challenge that the many lending institutions face, not just the World Bank, but is a challenge. The money is committed, but then there is a process to make sure the money is being spent on the timetable originally envisaged. Now, this is not under the World Bank's control. At the point at which the money is lent to the government, the money is there for the government to disperse. Now, there are certain aspects of disbursement that you have to comply with certain World Bank procedures and rules. Many of them are in place for very, very good reasons. Right? So we have many different safeguards to ensure that the money is not misappropriated, to ensure that it meets with the environmental and social regulations that the board have asked us to impose, to make sure that World Bank money is spent in the most effective way possible, but also consistent with these kinds of values that we have as an institution. Now, of course, this can create challenges in terms of disbursement. Not always are projects able to disperse on the original timetable. But the point here is that it's a collaboration. The bank is there as a partner to government to help them build the capacity to spend this money as quickly as possible. It's going to be a really important part of the evolution the World Bank goes through over the coming years in terms of figuring out if there's ways that we can be even more agile, even more nimble in terms of getting projects up and running very fast and then making sure that governments are able to disperse them rapidly. But it's not entirely within our control. We have to work collaboratively with government to do that.
I think that answers the question for now. Out of respect of time, we'll allow them. Again, those ones who want to partner with them, they will be here for a moment, and you're going to get in touch with them. We do have the OVC leadership, Dr. Shuri, Dr. Ngaka, and others are here to have you connected, and hopefully we'll engage in more conversation of this kind in the future. But again, gentlemen, thank you for all you do for the World Bank. You're doing that for the world and humanity. Keep doing the good job. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Can I have that, please? Thank you.
One more time for these ladies and gentlemen. At this point, we have a photo shoot here in a short while. But before we do that, I wanted to say this. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. We are truly, truly honored to have you, Susan James. It means a lot to us. There's something I put down. I do hope our partnership, whether it's with the Kenya government, which is here members, whether it is organizations like One Voice Consortium, whether it is individuals like all of us, will help us unlock, let me use your words, unlock those regional value chains that will help us move forward. And I do hope you appreciate it. And whether you like it, I don't care what you think about the World Bank, about Kenya. The bottom line is we need each other. The World Bank needs countries like Kenya, which is becoming more democratic more and more. Kenya needs the World Bank, whether you like it or not. I know some people may challenge me on that, but I do know partnerships are always good. In fact, after this, and I want you guys in the World Bank to be with us. Now you'll be the turn to ask questions, because I will ask the parliamentarians to come and take the hot seat now. We've got a lot of questions for them. We're going to talk. We like talking openly. This is America. We have freedom. And I'm protected by the First Amendment, so they can't stop me. So they can't stop me. I can ask them anything. So they'll come and sit here. We'll put them in two groups, six, one senator, 5. Then you guys ask them questions this time. But let's take 5 minutes break. The food is still a lot. You can still eat, stretch, but you guys stay here. We take a photo shoot. Everybody else stretch for 5 minutes, and then we move on. All right, Ben? Okay, good. Let's take that.
All right.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
It's a cultural
It's nice to meet you.
We're doing this event in Dallas. We are here for that purpose. Sorry for putting you on.
Very good. Thanks for the question.
Okay.